I just really wanted to document this experience, like I said, and what is required in the application for the psychological studies doctoral program includes an online questionnaire, which I already completed, unofficial transcripts, which I already submit, the sample APA format for my graduate program, and my resume and my paper, and then I'm going to revise all of this stuff, and I'm going to try to submit it tonight because the deadline is actually tomorrow.
So very briefly, when you are in a PhD research program, you have to find a committee, a part of the faculty that will assess your research and give you feedback. And this is what I'm doing in this next clip.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. My name is Melissa Matugas. Just some background, very brief background on me. I am a therapist, so I provide a lot of grief therapy for those that are experiencing chronic medical issues, and I also work in a private practice where I do grief therapy. So, grief and loss is an area where I'm very passionate about, and in Dr. T's qualitative research class, I was able to look more into lived experiences, phenomenological study type of things. And I'm very interested as an Asian American on the lived experience of Asian Americans that have experienced the loss during the pandemic. And so in doing some of the literature review for that specific qualitative class, there wasn't really any literature at all about it, although there were other minority populations that there was information about that on, not Asian Americans. And especially, with the hardships and the increase in violence towards Asian Americans, I thought this was a very important topic to definitely look more into. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Summarize, and please double check in the chat box that this is your correct email. That it sounds like you're leaning towards a qualitative study to examine those lived experiences of the Asian Americans who may have experienced loss during the pandemic. That is needed, absolutely. We have to look into that experience, and it is understudied population. You're right. You're like, I'm going to literature and finding something very much needed.
After I did that presentation, I had some faculty members reach out to me. So fortunately, my research was appealing. I secured a reader and also a chair that provided me feedback. I started to work on my research, and then shortly after, I had created a proposal. A proposal is a part of the dissertation process in which you propose the introduction of your research to your given committee members, and that's what you're going to see in this next scene.
I'm getting ready to do my proposal. I have on my nice little outfit. I'm wearing sweatpants because you're only going to be able to see the top portion of me. So here goes nothing.
This big day, her proposal, the day we've all been anticipating for a long time.
Thank you so much, Dr. We're going to start off by a quick introduction, but what we're going to be going over today in the proposal is the problem, the purpose, a review of the literature, including the history and demographics of the AAPI communities, and then we're going to dive into more of the grief and AAPI, which leads to this research question: Asian American subgroups and grief in the COVID-19 pandemic. Why is this important now? Who could benefit from this study? The purpose of this study is to examine the current literature of the grief response of Asian Americans who have experienced loss during the COVID-19 pandemic, and to disaggregate the different responses among subgroups, as each subgroup has been demonstrated to have specific differences. I passed. So this is what I've been doing for part of my research. Part of doing a critical analysis of the literature is to track specifically how you were able to find all of the empirical articles or any of the documents that you used. So I used a lot of Google Scholar because that's where a lot of the peer-reviewed articles are, and I'm doing my research on Asian Americans and grief in the COVID-19 pandemic. And so this is how I tracked everything. This is the number of results that came up when I did search for certain keywords and terms. And these are like really just the amount of articles that I ended up using, which is just pretty crazy because you can see here under results that there were 118,000 scholarly articles under grief alone, and then you can see that I start to add grief and Asian Americans, for example, and out of all of these articles I only ended up using 27, even though I did scan through a lot of the abstracts and the titles. So you may be asking, how do I remember which one of these articles fit under which category? So what I had to do was go back to my manuscript of chapters 1 and 2 and then create my own little graph here. I went back and I looked at all the articles that I used for chapters 1 and 2, and I did my own little table of what was a qualitative, quantitative, a published book, a literature review, or a review article. And then I went through and I counted which one of the ones above was related to grief, pandemic, or prolonged grief disorder, or complicated grief, bereavement, end of life, etc. So it's a lot.
So the final part of a Ph.D. program is what is called a dissertation defense. This is an accumulation of all the introduction classes and reading and research and writing that one has done in their dissertation program, including the manuscript, which is pretty much a booklet of all of the writing and research that a PhD student has done. And during this defense, the PhD student, in this case me, defends the topic to the dissertation committee, which is the committee that I was able to secure earlier on for my proposal, and that consists of a chair and a reader that gave me a lot of feedback along the way. And essentially, you either pass the defense or you do not pass. And if you do not pass, that means that there is not enough information, or there is some questions about your research that just didn't align with what you present to the committee. But if you pass, this is very good news. It essentially means that you are now able to receive your Ph.D. and you just have to publish your work depending on the school. And this is the last and final step of, again, of the Ph.D. and what you're going to see in this final clip.
How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm good. I'm a little bit nervous, of course, but
Well, with that, Melissa, I have made you the co-host, and so I will turn the meeting over to you. I'm going to mute my microphone, and then kind of how it will go is Melissa will present to us, and then afterwards, Dr. L and I will ask her any questions we might have, and then you respond to those, and then after that, we'll ask everyone to step out of the meeting, and then Dr. L and I will discuss, and then we'll call Melissa back in for some good news. All right? All right,
good.
Melissa, you got this.
Okay, so thank you again for coming to my defense. So today I'm going to be talking about my topic that I've been looking into, Asian Americans and grief in the COVID-19 pandemic. I did a critical analysis of the literature. And so I'm going to be going into detail about all of the literature that I reviewed and how I was able to select the certain documents that I reviewed. So before I get into the heart of the literature, I thought it would be a good idea to just give some brief information about why I was very interested in this particular topic. So I just want to go give some background into who I am and what led me to look more into this topic. So first off, I'm a grief therapist. I have a license in clinical social work, and actually my first job out of grad school after getting my MSW was a hospice social worker. So I have a lot of experience providing end-of-life therapy and grief and bereavement therapy to those that have lost a loved one. And in addition to that, I am an Asian American Filipina, and I'm the daughter of immigrants. My parents that are here today are immigrants from the Philippines. And so they really came here to the U.S. with, their set of challenges from the Philippines and getting accustomed to this new culture. And that really led me to just be more interested in the AAPI population. And then in addition to being a grief therapist, something that I noticed at the start of the pandemic, I'm in private practice, and I noticed at the start of the pandemic, I started to get a lot of inquiries from individuals that identify as Asian Americans, looking specifically for an Asian American therapist or somebody that identifies as AAPI, which I just thought was really interesting because I was in private practice 2 years before the pandemic and didn't get these sorts of inquiries, and really learned from these people that I spoke with that they had a hard time finding an Asian American therapist. So all of these things combined have really led me to this particular area of research. And I wanted to give more introductions to my committee and just really thank Dr. White and Dr. L for serving on my committee. I know I gave introductions earlier, but just to give more information on their particular background, Dr. White really has a major focus on human services and also has a lot of understanding and has conducted research on self-care with mental health providers. And when we first spoke, I felt such a connection to her, and I could tell she really was feeling the same sort of passion that I was with this particular research. So I really appreciate you, Dr. White, for serving as my chair. And I also felt such a connection to her as well. I could tell from the first time that we spoke with her deep background in education that she wants to close that education gap, and I really appreciate you being on my committee as my reader. So thank you, Dr. L. So let's go ahead and jump right into really the main three areas that I wanted to talk about with this particular study. So with this particular study, we're going to take a look at the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, there have been many people that have been affected by it, and there's been many deaths. And secondly, the funding or the research that we do have on the AAPI communities is really coming to us in aggregate data. So this is a concern and this is problematic, and we're going to look further into this. And then lastly, again, kind of the lack of information that we do have on grief and as how it affects our AAPI populations. So in starting off this literature review, one thing that I noticed was that there was very limited information on the AAPI. And when I say AAPI, this is a acronym for Asian American and Pacific Islanders, so just wanted to throw that out there. When I started looking into the literature, there was very limited information, and what I did find was this study, this phenomenological study from 1997 by the authors Braun and Nichols, and I'm going to be referencing quite a bit in this study because it's one of the very few limited studies on AAPI participants in grief. And really what they found was that when data was disaggregated for these 4 subgroups of Asian Americans, Filipino, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Japanese participants, there were really significant differences in grief. And considering the many lives that have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, it's surprising that there is no literature of AAPI responses to losing a loved one and grieving in the COVID-19 pandemic. And considering this growing population, there is a need to identify the reactions so that better services may be provided. So why do we need this study? According to many authors from this particular study and from reviewing the documents, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a disruption in end-of-life ceremonies. One of the authors, Pirtle, goes into detail about the racial and ethnic disparities for people of color. And something that I learned in reviewing some of these documents is that Asian Americans are really more likely to live with several family members or have jobs as essential workers. And so that lets us know that there's that possibility of being more exposed to the virus. So with this particular study, I really wanted to set out to answer some research questions. And those research questions are to identify Asian American grief responses in the COVID-19 pandemic and find out why is this important and pertinent now, to identify how to provide grief services to Asian Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic, and to answer who could benefit from this study. So we're going to explore the literature to answer these questions. So I want to start off by looking at the demographics. So there's a book entitled Asian American History by the author Dr. Lee, who really gives an example about the major differences in each Asian American subgroup immigration history to the United States. And so what that tells us is that even though we have this race that has this history of coming to the US, there's still these major findings of these unique differences of their experiences. And then in addition to that, the Asian race makes up over 40 ethnicities with many different languages and dialects, and again, many different unique differences that exist between the history of these subgroups immigration to the US. So here is a kind of timeline in some of the major immigration components of these different subgroups. So in 1587, Filipinos were recorded as the first known Asian group to set foot in the United States when they were actually escaping Spanish galleon ships. In 1790, the Naturalization Act banned Japanese Americans from obtaining naturalization in the United States. And then during the 1840s, this is when there was this massive sort of gold mining rush. And so this was the Chinese immigrants were the first largest group of Asians that settled in the United States. And kind of due to this,
Hi, Melissa.
Hi. My
If
stomach
you
is in
have
knots.
a chance to take a deep breath and to kind of do a little yoga and all that so that you can come back and receive good news. Are you ready? Are you ready to celebrate and be happy? Because, of course, you passed.
Oh, thank
You passed
you.
with no conditions. It was beautiful.
Oh, thank you so much.
We can't say it exactly official, but I think Dr. Matugas is
Oh.
going to celebrate to you.
Yeah, Dr. Melissa.
Yes. Or Dr. M, however you want to do it.
Have a wonderful evening.
Yes. Go relax, go celebrate.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
yeah. Tell your family. Your whole family waiting. So